Hello and welcome to the Gamedev Local Podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I am on a podquest to learn everything you wanted to know about game dev but never dared to ask. Today we have an interesting topic and I have to for once give a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. Mel is a lawyer, but I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. Anything we say for the rest of this session is not legal advice. Why are we putting in a caveat? Well, we're putting in a caveat because there's some interesting stuff going on in the world of the legals around micropayments in games. And in particular, Star Stable and the new new principles that have been released by the EU. Now, tell us a little bit about yourself first, and then let's get into the whole interesting story about Star Stable.
Cool. So I am a qualified attorney from South Africa, collective experience over 13 years within the legal industry and 7 years within the gaming industry as a game designer, game developer, and artist. So with that in mind, I almost have like a foot in a door, like in each different door. So yeah, I literally immigrated from South Africa to the UK. I'm not a qualified solicitor as I have to do a convergence.
Well, it's different legal kind of structures. They're same trees, but
different countries, different jurisdictions, exactly. Yeah. So right now I am a legal consultant, which is essentially a legal business consultant. I'm not regulated by the SRA, which means that I can sell my services, legal advice, business advice to gamers, as well as to creative industries like artists for a lot cheaper at a fraction of the cost of what a normal solicitor would, because solicitors are heavily regulated with insurance and so on. So that's just a bit of background information of myself. I'm currently a legal consultant for New Legal, as well as a legal consultant in my own business, the Agile Owl, which is focused on the video game and the art industry.
So let's talk about Star Stable. Why did you raise Star Stable? What's going on in the world of the innocent land of children playing with horses?
So this company I've always focused on because me being an avid equestrian, every kid out there who's an avid equestrian, even like Olympic athletes love playing Star Stable Entertainment. It's a game that is primarily focused on fantasy, adventure, horses, Nordic folklore, specifically the Swedish folklore. They mix it all in together, and it's the very first game that is focused as a MMO adventure game for equestrians.
Yeah.
With a pure focus on women and girl empowerment, which we haven't had a lot of that in the gaming industry. That's another topic entirely about women and girls in the gaming industry. But
come on, next thing you're going to say it's half the population. I mean, come on.
I mean, if we're gonna go there,
let's not because we could have all sorts of fun with that. So, what terrible things have Star Stable done to deserve the wrath of the EU?
Well, you'll have to. It's a good idea to always look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So, in context, they started out as just focusing on very small things like small little PC games that follows a story of a young girl who has magical abilities and, teams up with 4 girls who have magical abilities as well. And it's literally just based off a few little PC games back in the early 2010s, 2012. Well, 2012 is when the online MMO game came out, but essentially it was based on those small games. And in 2012, they started for the first time an MMO based on these stories, these small, like short PC games, as well as a book that's also come out by Helena. I hope I don't butcher the surname. Helena Dahlgren. So in 2012, they already had funding either from private investors as well as the government, the Swedish government, for whatever funding they could come up with. And they managed to create the very first gaming studio that focuses on bringing more women in to develop a game, and also a horsey game. So most of the people that work there are all equestrians or love equestrians, but that whole idea, the theme premise behind building a studio would be bringing in more females, or focusing on building a game that focuses on girls and females.
Yeah.
That kind of skewed the player base, because you do have a lot of boys that also play the game, and it's interesting because you only had a female character. Quite recently they've been bringing more cosmetics that would allow you to have a beard or facial hair and things like that to make you look like a more metrosexual male, but and I don't know from what year that Star Stable was bought out. If I'm not mistaken, it's quite recently. It was probably between 2016 and 2019 that they were bought out by investors. And from that point, they were doing quite well with the game. They were listening to their consumers. They were still doing shady practices from a consumer protection point of view.
Well, let's get into that bit in a bit, because that's the bit I'm really interested in, because I think that one of the questions I've always had with this thing is, when these things become very vitriolic, as it feels to me this is becoming, sometimes that's based on reality, sometimes that's based on bad behavior, and sometimes it's based on misinformation or misunderstanding of processes. And I'm always very nervous, particularly because the word loot crate has been bandied around.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to be what is on offer. And maybe I'm misunderstanding. But what is the practices that are at question?
So the European Commission, I mean, this has been a long time coming for Star Stable Entertainment.
Yeah.
It's been something that all of us consumers for the game have actually been pushing for more clarity, more transparency, and more almost methods to further protect their consumers, especially the vulnerable group. So this has been about, I would say, 5 years in the making, to be completely honest. And finally, last week Friday, we got word that the European Commission has now started an investigation into Star Stable Entertainment and probing into their consumer protection, game design, and the way that there's a lack of parental control, and there's also a constant push to buy in-game purchases.
Because I think, if I'm right, I think the EU article talked about essentially 4 key things: direct appeals to children in advertising, pressurizing techniques to purchase time-limited practices. Now, we should get into that in a bit more detail, because what is pressuring? What time-limited practices are normal things, but there's questions around that. It's the undue influence, I think, that's the question here. Lack of transparency of information, and a failure by the company. This is I'm quoting from the EU article. Failure by the company to ensure that influencers promoting their products clearly disclose commercial content. And I think those 4 things are really fascinating, because if you read them as face value, if you assume that there are absolute truths to these things, the potential consequence to every online experience. In fact, I don't think we hold physical experiences to this level of standard, if we take the worst case interpretation. Am I being overly terrified?
I mean, it's always difficult, because it's almost like there's a line that you need to be worried about crossing, especially when you're making a game that's targeting children. And Star Stable has always, to me, seemed to be crossing that line very subtly, but it is something that it should actually, a lot of game designers should be made aware of, is
Yeah.
where's the line, or how fine is that
Well,
line?
A, there a line, and B,
Yeah,
where is that
obviously.
line?
Because now you're only not just looking at selling a game just specifically in the UK, because the UK at the moment does not actually have any legislation outlawing loot boxes, but in other parts of the world they do, like
Yeah.
Belgium, Japan,
But
different
again, the
parts of the world.
definition of these are very
Different.
challenging because
Yeah.
of the opportunity for them to miss it. And also, I think that sorry, let me give a bit of full disclosure. So in 2015 at GDC, I gave a talk on the advocacy track about how free-to-play games have a responsibility to care for vulnerable players. And probably the worst rated talk I've ever had, because I annoyed everyone who was a free-to-play fan, and I also annoyed everyone who hated free-to-play, because I basically said, and by the way, I backed this up with psychological papers. I wasn't just talking my own opinion in this. I had some
Right.
supportive information to make sure I was giving a rounded argument. The fundamentals, though, were understanding whether there is a problem is actually the first question. We often hear people saying this is terrible, but we very rarely step back and try and work out. So let's talk about these four things. So direct appeals to children's advertising. So the question, I suppose, is, if we're going to draw a line, is, I mean, from your kind of contract principles in terms of consumer protection type principles, selling to a child is a legitimate action, is it? Or I'm assuming it is.
Yeah, so what Star Stable actually does is they, because I've even noticed on social media, they do Facebook ads, they do Instagram ads,
Yeah.
TikTok ads. I haven't seen a TikTok ad, but maybe they do. But they employ social media. They find where their consumers are most active, and I've seen that they push more adverts, or it kind of almost like pressures you into wanting to get into the game, especially the target markets that they seem to be going for is little girls that love ponies. I mean, there's a certain age that they're quite susceptible. I think it was...
So it's very clear that they are targeting in those ads a child audience.
Yeah.
One of the issues that there are some specific laws in UK regulation and in EU regulation, I can't remember the details of them, about prohibiting, I think it's specifically around direct transactions following those ads. I might be wrong on that, though. Somebody will probably tell us better. But there's clearly some direct constraints over what can and can't be done. There's reasons why we don't have, smoking as talking to kids, for example.
Very specific example.
Yeah, well, but you wouldn't throw a child into a smoking ad. You don't even have smoking ads anymore. So there are degrees of constraint, I suppose. But the interesting one there is that in this one, they're specifically saying urging them to buy or to persuade adults to buy for them in-game currency and items. I don't understand why. Again, this is me, maybe. I don't understand why you can't advertise a game and communicate that there are things you can buy in the game. But I do understand why you might not want to present an ad of this horse that you can buy for $9.99. Buy it now while stocks last. I think there's a clear difference between those two things.
Yeah, so from what I've seen on Star Stable, there's a huge discrepancy with they use star coins, which is their digital currency. So you use real money, you buy in-game currency, which is called star coins, but you can also earn there's a specific word that they call it, but Jorvik shillings is what they call it, which is literally money you can earn in the game that has no real life monetary value.
Yeah.
Star coins does have the real life monetary value. And when they advertise, they don't they're not transparent between you can earn this cash, but you can't buy a horse with this with your Vic shillings, but you need to buy in-game money in order to buy all these cosmetics.
And that's, I think, where we're getting into these dangerous areas where we are starting to use kind of bait and switch, essentially, techniques, which are dark patterns, for want of a better phrase. I think there are legitimate uses of multiple currencies in that way. I think the idea of an earnable currency that's only earnable through play versus a purchasable currency, which you may or may not also be able to earn through play, they are legitimately valuable things to use in a game design. But if you're using it purely to bait and switch people, that's a dark pattern.
Yeah, it almost feels like when you are playing the game, it's almost it's essentially on the brink of gambling. Let's just say it like it is, because
that's where I disagree. I do not think it's on the brink of gambling. The reason, so this is one of the things it's in my opinion, I do not think that the loot crate argument, loot crate is gambling. I don't think that's correct at all, except in one circumstance, and that's where you can cash out. So the reason is the psychological benefit of getting an object that I can utilize in play as a social show off has different psychological benefits to me than something that can be cashed out. When the motivation is departed from the principle of the experience into a secondary process, that's where I think we get difficult problems. And by the way, I'm coming at this because of some of the issues that occurred, particularly with some of the early MMOs like EverQuest, where gold farming was a thing. So you'd have people who would literally hire whole villages in some out of the way place to simply sit on tablets or machines to, well, it wouldn't be tablets
mine
at the time,
gold.
to just mine gold. And then they would sell the gold through various practices. Now, it's complicated because in those cases, you would sell an account.
Okay.
That's just handing over the username and password. So it is fair to say that the line between how you can cash out or not is an interesting one. But it's clearly a shady thing to do to buy someone's username and password. That's clearly shady. And that is clearly against the terms of service. So there's clearly something that's being done, and the effort required to do that is beyond the normal flow of play. So, I think that's a different beast than, for example, if in-game you can buy, if you're effectively playing a randomized loop, and that all you're doing is trying to do that randomized loop until you get the really rare one so you can sell it, you're no longer playing the game.
So Star Stable doesn't necessarily do that. They don't randomize. What they do, which is why I say it feels almost like an addiction of gambling, like you're addicted to the game, and they create a discrepancy with different items, cosmetic items.
Yeah.
Where, let's say, all of the older items, old cosmetics, are priced at a higher price point with star coins or shillings than it would be with the new stuff. So they're not very clear on that, but if you want a particular item, you have to mine the coins to get it. But
so let's dive into that. So let's use the word gambling. So again, this is a really important point. So Harvard Medical School has a particular definition of what addiction is. We often use the word addiction we've historically always used the word addiction for an excitement. We're excited. This is addictive gameplay. It's fantastic. But over the last few years, basically around sort of 2010, 12, 2015, around the time when free-to-play became the norm, it suddenly stopped being a good word. It suddenly started being used by people to say that we were causing harm. Now, the word addiction, actually using the word addiction, is a specific thing where the interaction is causing you harm. actual harm. So that's a really important factor. So gambling, the reason why gambling was early on was identified under the DSS 4 5. I can't remember when it was in there. Is because there's a physiological reaction with gambling where there is a genuine addiction that's got a physiological connection. So that's why gambling and addiction is 1-to-1. Well, not 1-to-1, but that's why there's a deep connection between those two things. But there's a different causal reaction with games, to the most part, according to a lot of psychological studies. Again, I'm not making this up for myself. I've read a bunch of studies. I may be cherry picking, but that's because I'm not a psychologist. I'm just going by the material I've read. And I understand that this is still generally the consensus, that the difference between gambling and games issues, gaming disorder as it's now currently being labeled in the World Health Organization, I think it's in DSS 6, they are talking about a behavioral response, not a physiological response. Meaning that a behavioral addiction, as I understand it, can have many symptomatic vectors, so ways in which you exhibit it, but there is an underlying cause. And so games generally aren't the underlying cause. They're usually as I understand it, they're usually the mechanism by which the behavioral addiction is affected. But that could be doom scrolling on TikTok. That would similarly be a behavioral addiction, workaholism. And these are not trivial things. These are very serious things. But the reason I'm being such a git about it is because we use these words like addiction really, really easily. And it's much more nuanced. It's much more important to get to why people are behaving there. And the reason it's so important is in the example you gave that you felt, and again, it's valid that this is how you feel, you felt that the way that they were selling these costumes was to make them so compelling that the desire for them was overwhelming people's rationality, and you used the term addiction to describe that. Is that fair?
Yeah, because there's only two options that you can get that. You either really grind a lot to get the Jorvik shillings, which is like 10,000 Jorvik shillings, which is the max you reach. Or you can buy in-game currency for like literally 20
but there is a third
to 30
option,
star coins.
And that's not to care.
Not that children do, and that's the point, because they've advertised to care.
This is actually really important. And there's lots of ways that we can not care. One is we don't care. Two is the game can provide you with so many different variations of opportunity. And the question really is, what is driving that factor? Is it the compelling game, or is it the social capital that asset gives me? Now, it doesn't necessarily just have to be social capital. It could also be aspirational desire. I aspire to that. And that would happen as a result of some good quality design process. But in itself, is it a harm? And that's my question. And I'm not saying it can't be. I'm just saying we need to take a step back and think about what the actual harm is. Otherwise, what we end up doing is we end up sweeping up general principles and damaging user choice, genuine user choice. The trouble is, if anyone misunderstanding where I'm coming from, please remember I did a talk at GDC about why we have a responsibility to vulnerable people. If you're listening to me talking about this, it's a balance, and I genuinely believe we need to be careful. But it sounds to me like they put lots of emphasis on owning these assets. And is it also selling the assets the issue, or is it the emphasis they've instilled about it that's the bad practice?
I believe it's the emphasis, because
Yeah.
they don't necessarily advertise to buy all these different cosmetics or buy these horses, but they add the emphasis on,
Mm.
and the problem potentially, as you say, like the behavioral issue that I can see could come into this would be a social kind of a social emphasis, because in the game you have opportunities to join clubs,
Yeah.
and I've noticed within these clubs you can only join the club if you have a particular horse cosmetic, outfit cosmetic, and there's
Oh, okay.
massive
That does
bullying in the
sound
game.
pretty. So, why I find that pretty damning, particularly the you can't join this club unless you have these things. The reason I find that so problematic is because that's social structuring.
And there's a lot of cyberbullying that goes
Yeah.
in the game. Like, there's
Yeah.
never a time where I look at the chats and there's some form of bullying that goes on.
That sounds very toxic.
It is extremely toxic. I
Yeah.
mean, the equestrian industry, it's a very toxic sports industry to be in. Like, most sports are political,
Yeah.
but horse riders just seem to be having a very bad reputation. And unfortunately, this game has that same toxic mentality
Yeah.
that is stereotypical of the equestrian industry. And I'm not meaning to knock on anyone. There are a lot of us out there that actually are nice people in the equestrian industry and not toxic, including me. But
there are
there
lots of
are
nice
those who would
people who play
destroy.
first-person shooters too. But we can't deny
Yeah.
there has been toxicity in that. So what I'm going to sort of suggest here is that I think direct appeal to children in advertising. There's a part of me thinks we need to just grow up and realize that there are ads that will go to children. The point is that there are best practices on how to do that respects the vulnerability of the child. And that's the bit that we should be up in arms about, not the fact that, children will see ads. That is part of life. The framing of that is, I think you highlighted earlier, the lack of parental control.
Yeah.
And to me, that seems to be the biggest problem. I think, one of the things that I think as a parent I've learned is that playing with your kid is a great way to help them understand what's acceptable and what's not. Giving kids freedom to learn for themselves can be good, but when you don't know what behaviors they're going to be exposed to, if you're not present when they encounter them, how will they know how to react to it?
Yeah, I've actually got a very good example of this. I haven't actually aired this on in public before. When I used to stream Star Stable back during COVID, Star Stable was the first game that I sort of actively streaming, apart from Overwatch and other sort of games. But this wasn't on air, thank God, and also maybe it should have, because it would have brought more awareness to children and how to react. But I was the victim of sexual assault in game with my character.
Your character was the victim of sexual assault. That's not great.
No, it's not. And also,
especially
I'm
in a
sitting
game
there
that's supposed to be about enabling
for
women.
kids. And for little girls. And I'm not going to go into the circumstances of what exactly happened, because to me, if it was in real life, I'd be like, I'm still shaken about the experience. It just, like, me sitting there as a 27-year-old and this experience happened to me, and I'm like, I can only imagine what little 6-year-olds, how would they react to that? And I'm thinking, who the hell is on the other side of the screen? Is it like an 80-year-old creepy, guy who just loves
it could be
children?
anything. It could be a naive child. It could be a malicious groomer. It's a conversation I've had to have. This is related to a conversation I've had to have many times about when you're managing and designing platforms for large communities. You've got to have good community management controls. You need to have protections, and in fact, one not related to toxic verbal abuse, although actually this came up when we were So I left PlayStation just before they introduced Pottermore spaces. I'm not going to get into J.K. Rowling; that's a different subject altogether. I will get very angry probably if I did that. But what was really fascinating about Pottermore is their extreme attention to detail
Yes.
around age constraint, as in managing safe spaces for kids. I think that was absolutely spot on. And they use some really smart tech to do moderation, identify patterns of behavior where you can look at basically words being used. Obviously, you can have white lists, you can have black lists, but also the idea of, I think I might be mixing up different platforms, but kind of like grey list style phrases. The idea being is that the word in itself is not an issue. The word in context or repeated indicates a potential risk. And so a scoring mechanism to identify conversations as potential risks so that you can review them prior to having to have a report.
Star Stable did do something like that, but only recently. And that's the problem, because I feel like they jumped on the bandwagon for that at a too late a date. Because they should have done that way before they actually started pushing this online game out there, because they had the funds to actually get more involved in research.
Well, the thing is that, so this is the reason why I don't choose to make games for kids, because to do it well enough, to do it properly, is extremely expensive. There's a great market out there, but to do it properly and safely and reliably and do all the things in the best possible way is incredibly expensive. And there's always going to be a pressure to reduce costs and cut corners, even with the best of intentions, But I think the biggest issue is that a lot of game studios don't necessarily have that exposure. I was lucky; I had the exposure to knowing that you had to have very strong moderation practices, really clear reporting structures, really clear banning processes, all this stuff. I mean, when I was at British Telecom, I could send a British Telecom policeman to your door, literally.
Wow.
In fact, that happened. We had a kid hack our email servers. British Telecom cops turn up. It wasn't specifically British Telecom, but we were able to get actual police turning up at their door. They were a 14-year-old kid. The parents were absolutely horrified. He was so apologetic. He then volunteered to be a moderator and was one of the best community managers I've ever had.
I mean, that's usually the story where the bad kid ends up becoming like amazing at moderating.
Becoming amazing, yeah, exactly.
I mean, like Catch Me If You Can, that whole entire story. That guy's like really famous, and he's most of the banking system for hacking.
Yeah.
Based off of this guy's advice.
Yeah, exactly. So the point of all that is that I think what we have to understand is intention is a massive part of this. And what I am always concerned at is when regulation has to state explicitly what intention is, because I don't think we're very good at it.
No, not really.
It's the classic pornography conversation. I know what it is when I see it. How can you regulate on the basis of that?
Especially when children come into it, because the child can never give consent.
Exactly. But also, if you think about contract law, if you're a minor, you're not accountable for your contracts, are you?
Yeah, in our
we're
contracts,
not using that enough.
Well, in most of the contracts that I've drafted, we always have to say that both parties agree that they are above the age of 18. And they have to be above the age of 18. I mean, I've dealt with one person who was 16, and he was developing a video game. He had to get parental to sign as a guardian on most of his contracts to deal with other contractors and suppliers, and that's just how you have to do it. I mean, the one way you could some kids at the age of 16, well, in South Africa at least, I'm not sure if it also applies here, but you could get emancipated from your parents.
Yep, I think so.
And that's yeah, it's a whole entire different
You
story.
can get
But
married.
yeah, you get married, you get emancipated, you can
Yeah,
leave the house,
yeah,
you can get a credit card probably in that
yeah,
case, and you get married, and you can, but you can't sign contracts without a parent or guardian,
yeah,
which, so then you'd have to hire someone, like open a business, and then you have someone who is over the age of 18 to sign on your behalf.
yeah.
Then you know, there's things like that, but that's the problem. The inherent problem when you bring kids into video games is they can't sign anything, they can't consent. So when you like sign in as a user for a game, specifically Star Stable, you have to tick to say yes, you consent to the terms and conditions, terms of use, privacy notice, and everything like that, but you're a child.
Yeah.
You can't
You can't be
really
held accountable
how
for it. So
exactly.
there's a couple of things that really make this particularly poignant in the UK right now, and that is the age-appropriate design code. So I did some work with the Information Commission Office when that was released to give some best practice advice for how developers could store their data, and be compliant. One of the things I worked out when I was reviewing it is there was an implication which basically says that you cannot assume that somebody is over 18 without evidence. And that is an absolute game changer. Up to that point, most companies, most organizations were reasonably okay with saying if you paid by credit card, either you or somebody has approved your use of that credit card over 18. Now, that was never quite true for the reasons you said, and there are other reasons you can get a credit card than just being over 16 or whatever. It was never quite true, but it was sufficiently an edge case that you wouldn't be, that meant that it was okay to do that in general. Now it's explicitly not allowed in the UK. So what do you do about it? Well, you've got to hold data on your consumer to confirm that they're over 18. And how would you do that? Well, you need a picture of a passport or a birth certificate or something. That's the only realistic way. But do you want to have every game developer having everyone's passport photo or your credit? Does that sound safe to you?
No, it opens Pandora's box essentially from a
And
data
yet,
privacy point of view.
and yet, whilst the ICO were clearly, in my opinion, targeting the platforms and storeholders of retailers, just like in the real physical world, who are responsible. The physical retailer is responsible for the age compliance, not the developer. But we're not holding the Apples, the Googles, the Steams, the social platforms to
Epic
account.
Store.
And guess what? When I set up my game on Android, or when I set it on Apple, when I set it up on Steam, when I set it up on Epic, they don't buy from me. They buy from the store. I get an anonymous ID. I do not get the actual person's information. So at the moment, what's going on here is the Yuki team had a call to what actions people should do in response to both the Advertising Standards Association's guidelines on microtransactions, plus the Information Commission Office and Age Appropriate Design Code, GDPR, all those kind of things, and lots of good stuff in there. But there's one line that I find problematic. They basically identify that the developer is accountable for the player,
Which is really difficult because it shouldn't even be the developer's responsibility. They just make the game. They're not collecting all of this private information.
and I'm not just saying this. I presented a talk on this with Michael from the ICO on this very topic. No, not the Yuki bit, but the functional process. If you are directly retailing, so if you have a web store and you are directly selling to a consumer, absolutely it's your responsibility. No question about it. Absolutely. You are taking a transaction, you have a player account, you are responsible to an extent some level of know your customer. And actually, the gambling industry is already ahead of the game on this. They have to do know your customer. It's mandatory. And if if you're essentially reselling games, there's a whole bunch of money laundering questions that are akin, or not quite. I'm more concerned about the money laundering implications of reselling game items than I am the equivalence of gambling. Personally,
Yeah.
lots of reasons for that. That's probably my legacy, that as in my history that I'm referring to there. But if you think about it, I think we're more vulnerable unless we can find ways around. Thankfully, there are some options out there. So there are teams like Usercentrics, I think it's Usercentrics, teams like that who have tools and support services so that a team can use an external system like that to check and make sure that that person is appropriate, blah, blah. But that's extra cost.
But also, on top of that, you have to make sure that they are compliant themselves and that they're registered with the ICO, because not a lot of people know, but you have to register your business with ICO and you have to pay about £40 fee annually.
You've got to have a chief information officer. You've got to have a definition of your usage of the data.
Privacy policy, which not a lot of developers, I've come across so many websites they don't have.
Well, maybe still some legacy indies, but it's essentially mandatory to have a privacy policy on all the stores now. That's mandatory.
And a cookie.
It's privacy policy and terms and conditions, which has to cover those other wider issues. Yeah.
And if you're selling anything on your web store, for example, I don't know, for whatever you're selling on there, you have to have terms of use as well.
Yeah.
Which I've noticed, not to target anyone, but I have come across so many of my own clients that don't have a privacy policy, terms of use, terms of service, nothing like that. And
or
you need to actually
lifted one from somebody else.
Or ChatGPT.
And forgot to change the details.
That too. I mean, it happens, and it's something that you don't think of it as it's an afterthought. And that's what I'm trying to drive, is that, data protection is at the most critically important time right now. It's been very critical, especially with consumer protection.
But it's also
such a nuanced topic.
Been pointed at, I would argue, the wrong targets. Now, I think there's some hope. I think some of the actions that the EU in particular has been taking against Apple and Google in this area, I think it's actually quite promising. I believe the very fine structure they've got in place for things like the Information Commission Office and the GDPR, I think for the ICO, for AADC, so Age Appropriate Design Code, the fine is something like £17 million or 4% of global turnover, whichever is highest.
Okay.
Now, that language to me shouts Google, Apple, Steam, Epic, all you big boys, I'm coming for you. Now, that's my opinion. I don't know if that's the case. I have no idea. But it seems to me holding the big boys to account is the way the language of the legislation sounds to me.
Yeah. I mean, we've often seen Meta and Google and all of them go through the bandwagon with data protection breaches. And I mean, they should be held accountable because they probably hold more than half of the population's private personal
of the
information.
Planet.
Yeah, it's a billion people on the planet. I'm pretty sure they hold everyone's information, and you can't escape them as well. I had a friend who tried to delete himself off of the internet, and he literally virtually could not. He's now back on. He now has WhatsApp and everything.
Again, this is where the EU might. It's obviously we're not in the EU anymore, so it doesn't count for the UK. But the right to privacy in the EU, I think, is a massively important thing, which we don't
GDPR.
Pay attention to. But by the way, bear in mind, we've only really talked about the first of these 4 items.
Yeah, we've got 3 more to go.
But so let's just I think a lot of the stuff that we talk about, the context apply for some of these other things. So when it comes to direct appeal for children advertising, I think for me, children were going to experience advertising, but there is a responsibility on the producer of the advertising and the structure of the way the game is offered to be reasonable and be aware of the impact on vulnerable people. But frankly, if you hide what you're selling, you don't sell as much. If you hide the fact, if you bait and switch people, They don't trust you. And trust is the only thing that's the actual currency for a long-term retaining game. The only thing that matters is retention.
Mm.
Because revenue is essentially a factor of it's almost like compound interest. If we kill the retention of the game because players feel they can't trust us, we are killing our revenue. It's not even in our own interest. We might get a short-term spike. Way, who cares? After a year, that spike is 0. It's a rounding error. And that, to me, is the fundamental problem we have. Is we have. I'm not going to blame accountants. It's not really accountable. But we have people thinking in numbers only, and not thinking about people and passions and why what we love about the game. If we're not focused on the love of the game, that's when we get issues like this direct appeal to kids, overtly persuading. Nothing wrong with persuading, in my opinion. That's a normal thing. Overtly persuading beyond someone's capacity to agree is manipulation.
Yeah, I feel like it all went wrong for Star Stable after they had investors on board, because before this they weren't having any harmful practices and they were listening to their community. But the minute that they had investors on board, suddenly all these issues started cropping up, and there was more complaints about how the game was
the fact is, you can't ever know. I mean, I've seen some amazing investors who want to make sure the game is successful. Obviously, they want the profit. Obviously, they do, but who respect brand, and that there are plenty of investors out there like that. But unfortunately, when you're talking about some of them, they are less worried about the brand and they're more worried about when they can cash out.
Yeah,
that's a fact. It will always be pressure on organisations to increase the hockey stick, the kind of uplift curve. That is inevitable. How we keep him on the ground is difficult. So let's talk about two. So two is they're kind of connected. They are pressuring techniques such as purchase through time limited practices. Yeah. So you tell Tesco that. Yeah, please, whoever wrote that, can you go and tell Tesco and Sainsbury's that they're not allowed to have time-limited offers? In fact, can you go tell consumers? Go tell consumers you can't have time-limited practices. Now, okay, I'm being a bit unfair and mean.
I mean, I haven't actually noticed the Tesco. I think I've been living under a rock, but what are the practices that they...
Well, no, but it's normal. You go buy one, get one free. Limited time offer while stocks last. Literally day-to-day normal behaviour. I know they're not talking about that, don't get me wrong. I'm just being mean. But when you have legislators using language that is ordinary, that's actually consumer friendly, it's consumer friendly to give them an offer. It's perfectly normal to put a time limit to that offer. And the problem, I think, is that a lot of designers like me, and I do this as well, use language like fear of missing out.
Yes.
Now, nothing wrong with fear of missing out, but it's a spectrum. When we talk about fear of missing out, I mean a reason to act now. That's not the same as a fear of missing out, or you'll be punished. We're not punishing people. We're not beating them up, but there's nothing wrong with us saying here's a limited time offer. And the reason we do it isn't through manipulation or anything like that. It's because people. So there's a bit of psychology around this. Was done by a guy called R. Bauer in 1960, and it was about talking about consumer behavior as risk taking. So what he was saying is that if you look at any purchase we make, you have anticipation, you have fear of missing out, you have social capital, but you also have this one other factor, which I refer to when I summarize it as abnegation. That abnegation is I've got to decide, and only I can decide this, but I can set aside the other things I should be doing. I should be washing up, but I choose to set aside the washing up because I really want to finish that level on this game. So I can choose that. You can't make me choose that. You talking about your game and how good it is will not make me make that choice to set aside the other things I should do. However, you might create the conditions where I make that choice because the anticipation is so exciting, because the opportunity I'm going to miss if I don't do it is important enough for me to act now, and the social capital of that thing is vital. And I think that's the gap here that they're talking about, is what level of anticipation, to your point actually, what level of fear of missing out, what level of social capital is there, and what point does that become undue? Does that make
I
sense?
guess, yeah, it does make sense. I think from the definition of undue, I feel like it's a bit of a loaded one because different legislatures define it differently.
Yeah.
So
It's a I know what porn looks like problem.
yeah, exactly.
I
I
hate to
mean,
get to be crude about it, but it's just that's a really known example of where ambiguity is, it's self-defined.
and I mean, Star Stable, I think they do. I mean, there is that FOMO that you get, especially they build up anticipation to something called Double Star Coins Weekend, which
Yeah.
is currently running this weekend.
Hey.
And there's that social interaction, that social behavior that, oh, I'm going to buy this new horse, and if you don't buy it as well, you can't be in our club anymore.
Yeah.
There's those
And I think
practices that carry on.
you've just nailed the actual line that's visible and clear. The connection between play, when you have a free to play experience, you are making a promise that there is something that you can do for free, and there are other things you can do that are charged. Where they are linked, or where there is a prerequisite of charge in order to do a non-charged thing, you're blurring the line of what the free to play is to such an extent that I think you're at risk of making it manipulative. So if you cannot join this club, the club's free, but you can't join the club unless you've got this paid for thing, that's not a free club.
And the other pressure that comes in is they lock the game after level 5. So it's free to play until you reach level 5, which is really easy to actually get to level 5. Like your progress to get to level 5 as a character, XP, is really fast. But you can't play the game beyond that point unless A, you subscribe monthly subscription, or B, you can buy the game, like the full game outright. But you could make friends in the game that is part of a club, and you can't join those kids in those clubs because they're in locked areas that you have to keep progressing
I'm
in.
less worried about that for this reason. To me, that's a demo. That's the same principle of a free to start, but there is a paywall. They've made a choice to put a paywall in there. Now, yes, the compelling draw of people you've made friends with that you can't connect to anymore, that I understand. That is a real issue. There might be better ways of making that less harsh, but at the end of the day, it seems to me that this is coming down to parental controls, parental buy-in, rather than just simple manipulation. It doesn't seem like a very good system if you are being focused on community building. But if they are having trouble revenue generating, I can see the temptation of putting in a paywall, because it does create a moment where you pay.
Yeah.
The question is, what is a reasonable level to have that marker point that doesn't feel like an undue enforcement, if that makes sense?
Yeah. What would you, in your experience, say would be undue in that circumstance? Like how would they push the
I think
boundaries?
if the only place that you could connect with people was in these specific clubs, and each club was specifically flavored by a particular high value item. Now that could have been got in a season, maybe for free, but is no longer. That to me feels like they're really stacking the social element. It's actually quite a successful thing if you manage to make that compelling enough, even with all those restrictions. That's actually quite an achievement, to be frank, because you probably have damaged your community by doing that. So I personally would separate out those things. I would probably have things that you want to purchase inside your club. I'd probably have things that you want to have as common shared items, like we can all decorate this club. But yeah, it's difficult. I might make it so you can't enter certain tournaments without having certain assets. That seems reasonable to me.
So there's two things that Star
Yeah.
Stable does, which I don't know. You could give your opinion on whether that is stacking it too badly on the social interaction. Is your club HQ building is in a locked area. So if you do manage to join a club, it's in a locked area. You can't get access to it until you pay. But then also the second problem is that
that seems like a bait and switch for me. But again, bear in mind, I've not played the game. I don't know what the reality is. I'm going by what the words you're saying. If I am given access to something that I cannot access, then I have not been given access to it.
Bait and switch.
That seems like you are ceding to me. What it is a thing, a technique based around reciprocation. So reciprocation, which is a perfectly valid technique in the right context with the right intention, but it's often very much misused and is one of the classic dark patterns. So reciprocation is, I give you a pen, you can pay for this $1 million insurance policy now, can't you? Because I've given you something, you want to give me back something, only the exchange ratio isn't valid, isn't equal.
Yeah.
So that's why if you see a lot of these weird insurance policies for over 50s, you'll often find they get a little carriage clock or a special pen. The value of the clock and the pen is nothing. The value of the insurance policy is massive.
Yeah, you find that in pet insurance as well.
Yeah.
Recently took out insurance for my dog, and it's massively built. But they're like, oh, but don't worry. If you sign on this month, you get a free camera from Ring. And I'm like, Ring is kind of crap, but because you have to pay a premium for it anyway.
Exactly.
So,
but that's the point, is like understanding. This is again why I struggle with use of language like this, which at one level of interpretation is business as usual. At another level of interpretation is abuse of people who don't have the capacity to make contracts.
Yeah.
And it's interpretation that is drawing the line. I think there's some valid questions that you've raised about this specific game, which are behaviors I would not choose to do. But there aren't many where I go, this is a black and white situation. But we should never be pressurizing people. If you pressurize people, that's really bad.
The other pressure that they do, which I've never really approved, and I've hated how they do this, is you get these limited, time-limited horse cosmetics, but they're locked to certain areas. You can't get access to those horses unless you've unlocked the game.
Charged for?
Yes. And you have to progress to unlock them, and you have to pay the monthly or pay the full game. But it's all locked. You can't get access to those horses.
That's all reciprocation playing. Yeah, okay. Not a lawyer, not a thing, but I wouldn't think that would be great personally. Giving somebody, look at this great cosmetic. If you buy it, that will give you limited time access to that space. Completely fine with that. utterly fine with that. But if I give you this free thing, but you've got to buy the keys to get into the area to use it at all, that isn't good. That is not a good behavior. Again, my opinion. Other opinions may differ. So we've got the first two. Directly appeals to children advertising, as I say. Urging to buy is fine, but knowing that the capacity to buy, actually, no, you can't. I don't think you can urge them to buy. I think I'm trying to remember the details, but informing them that the thing exists is fine. But the person you should be advertising to is the person with capacity to make the purchase.
Yeah, the adult.
The adult. So how you are structured now, kids buy things. Magic the Gathering, kids buy Magic the Gathering booster packs because they're given pocket money to spend. Where's the pocket money equivalent here? That's why I think the interesting ones are the points cards for Roblox or whatever else that you can buy. Club Penguin used to do this same sort of principle. You could interact in Club Penguin, as I remember. It doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. But Club Penguin, you could interact, but you could only use emoji if you're a free user. You could use free text if you're a paid user. So that, for me, sounded reasonable because there was a benefit from being a paid user, but you weren't prevented from interacting with people as a non-paying user.
And that's where you believe that there would be a line drawn as well. That's
an example of a line I think is not unreasonable. Again, I'm open to, whatever. I'm not a lawyer. I can't remember the specifics of the details of the legislation on advertising standards for marketing materials. But I think being clear, having a direct sale in the ad is not good for kids. It's not appropriate for kids, I don't believe. But showing, here's some cool things that are in the game, I think that's fine. But if those things can only be purchased, it's a bit dubious. So maybe that's a line. Pressuring techniques, well, I think it's fine having time-limited offers. The issue is the level of pressure and the undue complication. When using dark patterns, such as reciprocation, in the way I've described, that feels to me a inappropriate approach. Lack of clear transparency. This is the fundamental one for me. And ironically, the more obfuscated you are, you will sell less. It's just the reality. And the irony is, when you're dealing with, particularly with vulnerable people, transparency is absolutely essential. It's a way of protecting your game from being brought up in front of the EU. It's a way of protecting your investors by saying, we're very clear. And guess what? Yes, get more people spending money because they trust you more because you've told them what they're getting.
Yeah, I don't think many of the players actually know that when they are paying for star coins, especially these double star coins, as a child, you won't realize that what you're paying for is essentially another video game. Because it's as expensive as literally just buying another game. And what does it get you? Not much.
That I'm not worried about, per se. I'll give you the example. So I worked with a team that was doing a game called X City. It was a city builder type, like a farm build style thing on mobile, a long time ago. There was one woman spending $35,000 in just 9 months. One person.
Wow. $35,000. Wow, I would love to have that kind of cash.
So we talked to her. And she, Chinese-based footballer's wife, multi-millionaire.
Okay.
Her and her friends loved showing off with each other, and they happened to love the game. And they used how much money they could spend in the game as their fun thing they did for each other. I don't have a problem where you have the disposable income and you want to spend your money in my game and you don't feel manipulated or exploited in the process and you get good value for it that you value, fine. No problem.
But the point comes in, you're an adult. And that's
and
the
you're an
problem.
adult and have the capacity to make that decision. Absolutely.
But kids don't have that capacity, and they're getting pressured to buy these star coins,
Yes.
either through the theft of their parents' credit
But
card.
what I'm saying is, it's the manipulation. Pressure we've talked a little bit about, but it's not the number, as in how much a coin is worth. Is it reasonably targeted for a level of value they can understand? Yeah.
Yeah.
And like you say, if they don't understand that they're spending $19.99, they could have bought another game, and they're getting a few ribbons for their horse. That is not value that they can comprehend properly if they think that's the same value as a full game.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. And I think that's one of the reasons they're also being targeted for the EU to commission to actually investigate them.
But I'll chuck something at you.
Isn't transparent.
If they happen to have a ribbon that was so cool and so exclusive that you really wanted it, would it? And you had the disposable income and the capacity to make the decision, and it was just the one you wanted, should you not be able to buy that? Should you be banned from buying that?
I suppose it is up to the opinion of the person. Like,
Yeah.
if it was worth it, like you really wanted
And that's the condition I'm talking about here, is where you have the capacity to make that decision, and it is the thing that gives you value, and having purchased it, you feel comfortable and satisfied. Look how cool that shit is. I'll give you an example, right? How many people buy extremely expensive labeled bags?
Which is so stupid in my opinion, but a lot.
A lot. I can buy a tote bag for 80p.
But the same
But you're
tote
going to
bag.
get a Louis Vuitton for $8,000. Why?
Yeah.
Capacity.
I guess it's also, I mean, for one thing, they're really good at their branding, but also the social interaction. So
I think it's ugly as hell. I don't even like the look of them. I think they're terrible things. Badly designed
I think
bags.
so too.
Not always good materials. I mean, okay, I'm being a bit unfair. I'm just being a curmudgeonly old git. But if you love that brand, if you associate your identity with that brand, who am I to say you can't do that? Again, reminder to anyone listening, I did the talk about vulnerable people, responsibilities for vulnerable people. I'm not trying to say we're not responsible for vulnerable people. Anyway, clear and transparent information. So that's the third one. The fourth one is failure by the company to ensure that influencers promoting their products clearly disclose the commercial content. Oh, it's a hard one, that one. The reason I think this is hard is when you were streaming this game, were you being paid to do it?
No.
Is it your responsibility as a non-paid streamer who loves the game to be transparent about the pricing structure of the game?
It's not my responsibility as a streamer, no. If I'm being paid for it, it should be. And I should be making that clear.
That's the point where we're starting. So I think this is the where the influencer, I'm not a fan of the word influencer, content creator, let's call it that. Where the content creator has a commercial relationship with the company, they should have clear guidelines on what's going on, because they are a vehicle of marketing that company. And all of the rules that go into marketing, advertising, I personally think should apply to those people too.
Yeah, I don't know if Star Stable has actually created guidelines like that. Maybe they have, because there are a few paid content creators, but I don't think it's a practice that they've necessarily been very focused on, because all those content creators who are paid content creators for Star Stable and promoted quite avidly, they never talk about things like data protection and people being more careful, like, like parents making sure they keep an eye on the spend of the child, parental control. Like, they don't talk about very important topics like that. They just talk about the game, and that's pretty much it.
Now, I see all of this as part of the maturation of the games industry. I think we're still struggling with being the outsider, even though we're the largest form of digital entertainment on the planet. The governmental forces have yet to really understand digital goods. And I think that's shown by these kind of complaints. Not saying they're not valid. I'm saying the language they use and the pieces that they pull out as vulnerabilities, I'd almost call it naive. I mean, again, that's a bit unfair. I know a lot of the individuals who do work in this area aren't far from naive, and they are doing their best to find wording. But I think whenever you're dealing with language that has to be conveyed broadly, that has to be measurable, it's not unlikely you're going to end up with language like those complaints that were raised. And I'm actually quite proud that the UK decided not to ban loot crates, because some of the wording that was being proposed, for me, felt like it was overreach. And in fact, all credit to particularly Michael at the ICO, because they worked really hard. It would have been so easy for the age-appropriate design code to overreach. And they worked really closely with the games industry to minimize that risk. And I feel very proud that I got to play a tiny part in that. And that was just direct best practice recommendations to games teams. But to observe that was really good. I felt really proud, really pleased to be able to be part of that.
Yeah, it sounds awesome.
Yeah, it was great. But more case, like I said, my role was so tiny, it's hardly worth mentioning. But the work that they did with people like Yuki and Tiger and stuff like that was very much what it should have been. Namely, industry connecting with government to find ways to operate sensibly. We do have some hangovers, and that's what I mentioned when it came to the consequence of the decision to say that you could not assume someone was over 18. There's still consequences for things like that, but we'll get through that. But if you look at the EU guidelines that were released on the 21st of March, what they talk about is pretty sensible. So price indications should be clear and transparent. That's perfectly sensible. Practices obscuring cost of in-game digital content and services should be avoided. Completely sensible. The question is going to be how it's going to be interpreted. Principle 3, practices that force consumers to purchase unwanted in-game virtual currencies should be avoided. Well, we didn't talk about this specifically, but buying a bundle of 100, but you only need 73 coins, what am I going to do with the excess?
So you just save it up.
Yeah, so that's not allowed under this principle, but it's also not allowed under the advertising standards principles in the UK as well. And I believe they can enforce that. I can't remember the mechanism they can, but anyway, issues. 4 was consumers should be provided with clear and comprehensible pre-contractual information. That's pretty damn clear. Tell people what they let themselves in for. That will get hidden inside terms and conditions. I know it will.
And people don't read their terms and conditions.
No one reads the terms and conditions. And when the terms and conditions are 15 pages long and you're watching it in a phone size shape, which is
it's difficult.
Not great. But the principle of being clear matters. And as I hope I've made the argument, I think that that's something which is in our interest as retailers. Consumers' right of withdrawal should be respected. I think this isn't something I remember seeing in the ASA guidelines, but I think is a good principle. But if you think about it, Steam already kind of does this. Apple and Google already.
Star Stable does not.
Yeah, if consumers are unhappy within a certain constrained rules, they have the right to withdraw. And as retailers, when we're doing direct to consumer retail, which increasingly is becoming a thing, it is in our interest to respect that. It's Yeah, go for it.
as a consumer, you have about 14 days as a
Yeah.
cooling off period to request a refund. But the thing is if you don't explicitly have that in a terms of use, terms of service, your T's and C's,
Yeah.
then the buyer or the consumer has more than a year to actually still request a refund.
Yeah. Well,
So
it's worse than that because if somebody can play the game, so for example, if you have a 2 hour long game on Steam, players will play it fully and
and then
claim it back.
request a
And they'll do that regardless, with no care of the time, the effort, the love, the power that was put into it. So, I mean, I'm not saying every consumer will, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that. But there is this balancing act here.
But that's where you should have some sort of system put in to say if you click the buy button,
Yeah.
or some mechanism in there to say if you play the game for the entire duration and you've played
Yeah.
it to the full length of the game, you've already consented and said, I agree to the terms and conditions. I waive my right to request a refund
But
because
at
I've
what
played it to
level
the
is
full.
that? And I think this is the challenge. And I think it's a genuine challenge we have, which is what is a point where you've fully accepted it? And if it's bad after that point, what recourse do you have? And I'll give you an example. People often talk about free to play being evil, but I think the most evil game I ever bought was Duke Nukem Forever. I like to joke about Duke Nukem Forever because Duke Nukem was one of my favorite games back in the day. We had so much fun back on Wireplay playing Duke Nukem 3D, and yet when they released it, they killed Duke Nukem Forever. It was so bad. It was not of merchantable quality, and I'd paid full price. Now, as it happened, I could have claimed that back because it was a physical retail. I could have gone back to retail and got it. I never did because I like to have it on my shelf so I can say, look, this is the evil game. But my point is, it's complicated to work out where is the right point. Because if you do something that doesn't meet consumer expectations, you should refund them. But you're going to be paying a price anyway. Because if you have somebody who's unhappy and you refund them, they'll tell some people, they won't tell everybody. If they have a problem and you refuse to refund them, your name is blackened by scale. Anyway, so I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Principle 6 is contractual terms should be fair and written in plain and clear language.
A bit difficult when you have kids, like playing these games, because they can't understand these.
Is it though? I mean, sorry, it's always difficult to do things in plain and clear language. But you should still be communicating in fair and clear language.
Sure, but if you have a 6-year-old playing the game and they create an account, they wouldn't understand. I mean, I could literally take my terms and conditions and read it to my niece, and she won't understand. She's clever. She's a 7, 8-year-old,
Yeah.
and I don't think she would get it.
Lots of words.
Lots of words, yeah. And most of the times they're too legal. They put in legalese language, and it needs to be clear, concise, simple to understand.
But I like
in
the
layman
ambition
terms
of that principle. But I think the point you're making is, I would argue, is more about the requirement of who you're writing it for.
Localization. That's why, I mean, even in policies, localization is important.
Well, not just localization, but also you're writing it for the person who the contract's going to be with. Namely, it needs to be written for someone with capacity to make a contract.
Mm.
And if you got the requirement to have someone with capacity to make the contract, how are you supporting their ability to oversee an experience for somebody they're empowering to play the game that does not have that capacity?
I kind of wonder if there's a way you can create a little technique to just force people to read the T's and C's by just saying, you can tick to agree to the T and C's, but there'll be a block to say, if you've read the T's and C's, you'll see a keyword. and you'll be able to input the keyword in.
I think nobody wants to read the T's and C's.
That's the problem, because then you have to read the
but you
T's and
shouldn't.
C's.
As a consumer, I shouldn't have to. The consumer protection regulation should be sufficient that it would be an aberrant behaviour. I would argue. I'm not saying this is realistic. I'm just saying, instinctively, teams should be held accountable for doing reasonable things.
I guess there is a level of protection with the CPC, and then in the sense of you'll always have that protection as a consumer, but you always need to be a bit careful, because most of these T's and C's, if they are not, if they've put in a clause that waives one of your remedies that you wouldn't normally have as a consumer protection. For example, consumer protection, you're giving all these rights and remedies, and you can claim a refund. Those rights you can never you can never outright explicitly refuse a person to have, like a consumer to have. But sometimes those T's and C's would have extra clauses in there that would be important to read. For example, I recently came across an artist who was actively pushing for the public.works site, and saying that if you're an artist, you can definitely go and find artwork that's already in the public space, and you'll be allowed to use it, and you won't get any copyright infringements against you.
Yeah.
That I was like, you cannot push that without actually reading the T's and C's, because when I went to the public works and I saw the T's and C's, it's explicitly said that nowhere in there are they going to be held accountable for all the artwork that's on that site, because some of the artwork has still got trademark and copyright protection on it. So that's why it's so important to read the T's and C's, because they're explicitly putting a disclaimer saying, by all means, you can use this artwork, but it's not on us if you have a copyright or trademark infringement.
I think there's a difference. I agree with you on that entirely, and I will read. I often end up reading contracts or get somebody I trust to read the contract. I kind of like legal language. There's a little part of me that thought I'd do law, but no, I was never going to do it realistically.
You saved yourself the pain.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I did a tiny bit of law in my business and finance piece, which I still have a big thick book of contract law in British English contract law. I do kind of like language. I like the nuance. I like the logical processes of it. I think that's quite interesting. But as a consumer enjoying a game, just let me play. And I think there's a natural. I think if we ignore the fact that the habit of the player is to just say, "Just let me play," we're not being honest about the nature of what terms and conditions can and should be allowed to do. I would argue. The problem is that argument falls down completely, because how the heck are you going to manage and control this stuff properly without some sense of legalism? But right now, I think we've overly, we've made it the problem of we made the company put terms and conditions and a privacy policy to state their actions. But actually, all it does is protect the company. We have to rely on consumer legislation to protect the consumer.
Well, that's true. And you do have remedies. There's a certain level of responsibility a company has to have to protect your personal information. Like if there's a data breach, they have to tell you about it. And there are levels of protection for the consumer within.
I can't tell the company I don't agree to that term, change it to this. So I don't think, in practice, the terms and conditions and privacy policy are actually at all useful for a consumer, because we can't disagree.
Yeah, you either buy the game or you don't.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. I think that I think there was a push a while back, I don't know if it's still the case, to basically invalidate a lot of terms and conditions on the basis it wasn't reasonable to expect a player to read them. But I personally think that there is no empowerment on the player to be able to influence those terms and conditions or privacy policies. Their only real remedy, arguably, is through lobbying government for
I
consumer
mean,
protection rights.
terms and conditions are also put there to protect the company itself
Oh,
as
that's the
well.
only purpose, I would argue.
Yeah, I mean, like a company does need to have terms and conditions, a privacy policy, cookie policy, everything like that.
Oh,
It
I
needs to be
agree.
fully compliant so that they don't get in trouble with the government. And if they
But
do
you're
get sued,
making
there's
me agree
protection.
to them when I don't have, even with the capacity to agree to contracts, where I have no influence on their outcome. This is we should have this conversation for a different podcast because there's so
Yeah,
much. Again, I'm being
perfect.
deliberately mean here. I'm being deliberately kind of pushy because I think that we should be questioning the way we are slapping on. I'll give you the cookies example for me. I think it was one of the most damaging to personal safety on the internet that was ever done.
How so?
Because now we are in a habit of pressing yes to buttons we shouldn't be necessarily pressing yes to.
Are you? I'm just out of interest because when
Yeah.
you usually get a cookie banner, the
Yeah.
cookie banners is actually supposed to
How do
give you
you
the
know it's
option of
actually a
rejecting.
cookie banner, not a virus unpacker?
Well,
How
that
do
I
you know that? Do
actually
you have are you technically competent enough to know that button that was put it up that was actually going to be an actual cookie button and not some phishing exercise that's going to put a key tracker on your browser?
Well, that's actually a very interesting topic, probably for another podcast because I want to get into that. But
Yeah.
that's interesting because
Look, this is unlikely. I'm just throwing out. We've created a pattern of use of the internet that puts us at more risk because of cookies, which are a fundamental building block of the process of running a website
or a business as well because you
or a
use
business.
cookies like for
Fundamental
analytics
process
and advertising.
necessary for the process. And rather than finding a way to structure that properly, we put a, say yes to it.
But that's a problem because you're not just supposed to be doing that. You're also not only just the cookie banner, but you're also supposed to explicitly put
You're,
what are the cookies on
you're
your privacy
supposed to,
policy.
yes.
But
But
no one ever
what
does.
benefit is there to the consumer to do that? They don't understand necessarily what that means. And I'll give you the classic example. This is that when Apple did the IDFA, so they got rid of the ID for advertisers. You had to say that you accepted, that you would have some information pass, or you would reject it. The language used when it was an Apple product was, in order to improve your experience, we need your permission to be able to handle this information. Are you okay with that? Yes. If it was anything else, danger, danger, Will Robinson, everything's going to be terrible if you press this button. Press no. I'm exaggerating. Obviously, Apple weren't quite that mean. But in order to explain the emotional difference between the two, that's the easiest way for me to say it. So I think there's some shenanigans that have gone on as a result of these kinds of so-called privacy actions rather than being actual benefits to the consumer. I'm so cynical.
It's definitely another topic for
an
episode.
So we were talking about
so much into that.
Principle 6, contractual terms should be fair, and the last of them all. We're an hour and a half into our podcast of 50 minutes. Game design and gameplay should be respectful to different consumer vulnerabilities. I actually love this. I think that there's lots of questions and misinterpretations of it that will happen. However, the idea that we should be paying attention to vulnerable people and ensuring that we create experiences that are relevant to them, I think is great. But why are we not talking about people who have, maybe have vision issues,
Disabilities.
issues, maybe economic differentiation, maybe neurodiversity? I mean, I'm not being entirely serious. Whole bunch of questions that come out of what does vulnerability mean?
Sure, that's it's defined. It's what an open definition of vulnerability is. Um, I specifically, like, last year I actually took a course because I was thinking of teaching horse riding as a career, and you had to the sport body. I think they call it safeguarding.
Yeah.
And vulnerability is those who are below the age of 18 who
Yeah.
have no consent, and anyone with certain disabilities that they don't have the mental
Yeah.
capacity or
Exactly.
the physical capacity to be able to
To be
consent.
fair, that is kind of what this is about. But when I think there are some areas where some of that leaks into some of the wider questions,
Mm.
um, you know, um, particularly some of the spectrum issues. Uh, for some people, some of those, I don't want to say extreme because spectrum is not just a single line, but there's some elements which will have different impacts on people's ability to feel safe, and that will have an impact on their ability to feel they can respond to certain piece of information. Anyway, I don't, again, not an expert on that sort of stuff, just throwing it out there.
Mm.
So I think overall, my take on it is that essentially the basic principles are perfectly fine. And actually, I think largely pretty similar, if not identical, in some places with the existing advertising standards and guidelines and the best practices that have been recommended by people like Yuki, and the issues identified by things like the age appropriate design code, all of which I think are really solid, interesting. So I think the UK's legislative position is actually pretty good for this in general. But we
Yeah.
do have these outliers where we have some unhelpful for smaller indie teams that could risk creating barriers to entry. And I think we remain at risk of legislative overreach, in the sense that it'd be very easy to write things or to enforce things that would actually simply impair consumer
Mm.
experiences, would not actually protect them.
Yeah, I know a case of this is actually not in this country, it's in the UK, but a case in point of this is if you over legislate a particular area, it does make a barrier for entry. For example, in South Africa, when I was a drone lawyer back
Yeah.
then, it was such a highly, overly legislated particular area. You could fly drones around for fun, but you couldn't actually like use drones in a commercial sense.
Yeah.
There were so many businesses. I came across so many different entrepreneurs that had these most amazing ways that you could use the drones for, to improve security, agriculture, technology, education within South Africa. But the Civil Aviation Authority highly scrutinized commercial drones because they were worried about, privacy. And because of that, because they didn't understand what drones were, they they made so many barriers of entry for drones to be on the market and for you to get your license. Every single time someone would come along, they'd be like, "I want to get a license." They the barrier for them to enter into that market would be close to about £500,000
Yeah.
just to get the commercial
And
license.
it's just
So eventually everyone
done.
just give up.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's nothing else much done with the
And
industry.
the impairment on innovation isn't just about, technical. It's also about creative. In this case, if a game, it's also about things that experiences that we've had as players that were life defining, personality defining. The kind of games that I played as a kid, games like the Muds and the Shades that started me out, D&D, games like the Star Wars arcade trench game in the wireframe back in the old arcade machine era, Battlezone, games like Skyrim, and so all of these kind of creative experiences help define who I am. And if we constrict the ability, particularly around the indie game scene, because the legislative burden becomes overwhelming, what we do is starve the industry of talent, we starve the industry of creative direction, of innovation, of different kinds of storytelling. And what I think most exciting thing, why I've spent so much time working with indie teams, is because I just love the fact that we can do things that is too risky for the bigger teams. But that goes away if we start overly legislating, if we start making it too complicated for the general public developer to be able to express their content. But that doesn't mean it's good enough for people to create content that is exploitative, that is manipulative, that is not good enough to accept bad practice. So we have to find the balance between the two.
Yeah, I agree with that. It kind of reminds me of, I forgot the politician who actually made the comment recently, and Yuki did an open letter to him.
Oh, that was actually the footballer, Neville. Hang on, what was it? Yes, it was the footballer who made the comment.
That video games are like violent and
Oh,
that's so definitely annoying. That's really annoying because I mean you hear the argument so many times in South Africa where they say, oh, the video games are violent and that's why the crime rate is so high. It's not. It's literally, it's all down to, I mean, it's down to many factors. But video games, as you say, is something that helps to define a person. Like I've also, like, Skyrim defined my childhood. Fable, Final Fantasy games. My favorite was Lightning from Final Fantasy 13. All those games defined who I am, defined my career trajectory. Define my personality, my character. So video games are actually really important. And this is something I also advocate a lot, is that yes, video games can do some harm, but it really is up to that person's,
It was Gareth Southgate, sorry.
Gareth Southgate, yeah. So, I mean, I don't agree with him at all.
No. I think Gareth Southgate was trying to make some really important points about the value of social connection and physical activity. No problem with those things. My problem is that he completely dismissed the value of digital connection. And I in my post to forward that particular Open Yuki letter, I highlighted an event that I was helping with the launch of a game called Actress Soccer 3. So Wireplay, an online gaming service, helped with the launch of the Gremlin game Actress Soccer 3 back in 99 probably, I can't remember. And at that event, we had people like Alan Shearer. We had a couple of other local fairly, I think, Premier footballers, but London-based. We had a whole bunch of journalists. Some of them were based in London. Some of them were based in Bristol. Some of them were based, I think, Bournemouth. So we were playing live online with real footballers, a game, hugely exciting. And the people who won that game were the footballers. And the reason why I think that's irrelevant is because you couldn't have had all those people playing together in one physical space. It would have been impossible. Digital connections allowed it to be possible for so many people from different backgrounds and different contexts to engage in the passion that they loved, the physical sport. It did not stop them going out and playing in the real world.
Yeah.
It was
comments like that is actually, it does cause the legislature to get involved. And in South Africa, those comments from politicians and from like the publications, that was like ongoing behind the scenes all the time. And unfortunately, because of those comments and because of the high crime rate in South Africa, and I think the crime rate in the UK is also on the rise, which isn't necessarily helping, but the result of those comments and the lack of understanding of how beneficial video games actually are from like a digital social interaction, as well as like shaping personality or shaping the world of the child, it causes the legislature to get involved and say, okay, we need to put laws in place to further restrict. And in South Africa, the Film and Publication Board further restricted the age ratings because of this comment about violence. And at the time, I was working with a team, and we were building. It was a mobile fighter game based off of a blockbuster film that completely flopped, but it was such a violent movie that I couldn't even watch the premiere or support it, even though, you know, I had to as a project manager. I hate violent movies. It was on the same lines as Quentin Tarantino, but not as
which
funny.
I love.
I cannot, like, I literally, it's squeamish.
Yeah.
So I couldn't go in and support it, even though we were making a game based on this. And at the time, this Film and Publication Board new legislation came about, and then I had to tell my company, heads up, this has now happened. We now have to go back to planning, back to the pre-production, and just look at how this game is going to be developed in line with those laws. Otherwise, we're going to be targeted, even though the Film and Publication Board only looks at films, but they're also now getting more involved in the video game industry in South Africa. And we had to figure out how to develop this game in a way that actually would be allowed to be sold on Apple and Google to children.
Yeah, it's an absolute. Now, one of the really interesting things about the violence thing is we were attacked about, as an industry, we were attacked over the whole topic of violence for decades, literal decades. So one of the classic ones was a friend of mine, Kate Edward, did when she was heading up the IGDA. She was heading up that at one point, and she did a talk about this, and she said, look, here is the stats for violent video games. Oh, it's going up. Here is the stats for violence in the real world. It's going massively down, proportionately down, literally proportionate to the increase in violent games was a decrease in actual violence. And it was kind of funny because, I mean, violence obviously not funny, but it was kind of funny because it was almost evidence. This is not the case. It's a correlation, not a causation. But it was almost, you could have made the argument of a causation of, let's have more violent video games in order to reduce the actual violence further. I'm not condoning that as an argument. I just thought it was funny. It was just funny seeing those graphs. They were so aligned that the increase in violence in video games was matched by the decrease in violence perfectly.
I mean, that's why we have scream rooms and distraction rooms. I mean, I don't know if they have that here in the UK, do they?
I haven't seen anyone do that regularly, but I am aware that such things have happened. But we are in minute 1 hour 42, so we better call it an end. It's been an absolute delight, and thank you if you've stayed with us for this whole thing. I don't know whether the editors will decide to cut this into 2. We shall find out. But we've had a really thorny topic. What do we do about the legislative restrictions that are coming at us rapidly? Thankfully, in the UK, a lot of them are very familiar. A lot of the process are familiar. But when we see games like Star Stable being targeted by consumer bodies about their poor behaviour, what calls can we make? Hopefully we've given you our views. Again, a reminder, I'm not a lawyer. We're not making any legal advice. I'm not necessarily saying that any of our opinions are correct in this space. These are opinions that we're making. But what are your opinions? What do you think is the reasonable line? Is it a clear cut that all games should be treated as if they are manipulative, evil, and destroying the community? Okay, this game's an industry audience. I suspect that's not the answer. Or should we be a bit more careful about how we're presented? Should we be thinking a bit more intelligently about the implication of the design choices we make, that there are consequences to them, and that we have a responsibility, in my opinion, I think Mel's opinion too, for looking after vulnerable people in our games. And I think it should go beyond that. And it's in my opinion, it's in the game's best interest to build trust, because if the real opportunity for a game market is in long-term retention, which is my belief, if we lose trust, we kill long-term retention. Trust is more important. Trust is what helps us build a strong and solid economy, a strong and solid community. That's what we should be focusing on. And there are always going to be naysayers. There are always going to be people trying to catch us out. And it's difficult when you're someone like me who's been spending a whole career with people telling you that your industry is terrible when you know it's not. So I might be going too far the other way. Anyway, so that's my view on it. Mel, do you have any final words you want to share?
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to be interesting what's going to happen and what's going to come out of this, the Star Stables investigation. An article has dropped yesterday on what exactly they're looking into, and one of the things that has been touched on is loot boxes.
Yeah.
I have also been told that it is potentially going to cause the UK consumer bodies to actually look through their own legislation. Whether that's a telltale sign that they're actually going to change something, we don't actually know. But this is an interesting space to just keep an eye on. But it is a case study for you to actually look at yourself if you're interested. Just see what's happening with Star Stable, learn from their mistakes. And I mean, every single video game company that always is under rapid fire from the Consumer Protection Commissions globally, or, you know, even from other rapid fire issues, for example, fraud or any business issues, or they sued, everything is a case study for you to go back and look through and learn from their mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, failure is your
at the end of the
biggest
day, it's not just the case that bad actors damage consumers. There's a knock-on effect that can cause greater damage to even the people who are trying to do the best.
Yeah.
On that note, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. If you liked it, please, like, subscribe, share, etc. If you have any thoughts, then remember there's a Discord. Gamedev Local have a great Discord where these kind of conversations can carry on. You can tell us what you think. What would you do differently? How would you hold people who are acting in these irresponsible or bad practice mechanisms? How would you hold them to account? Are there better ways that we could operate? Are there more conversations we should be having on the legislative framework we operate in games? And how much did you know? How many of you out there knew about the age-appropriate design code? How many knew that the UK's Advertising Standards Agency has a code of conduct? How many of you knew that Yuki had a best practices process? If you didn't know, you need to find out. And that's what we're trying to do by having this podcast, keep talking about these things. So thank you very much again for joining us. Mel, thank you very much. And we'll see you again next time on your Gamedev Local podcast. Thank you very much.